watch it later on, as we have a small and select audience here today. So, but she will be on record, and she'll be available for people to watch and to learn about her interesting work. She has a very impressive bio, which I intend to read. She is Professor of Political Science and Philosophy at the University of California at Irvine, where she founded and directs the UCI Interdisciplinary Center for the Scientific Study of Ethics and Morality. She's a past president of the International Society of Political Psychology. She was vice president of the American Political Science Association, and she's also the author or editor of over 15 books and 100 articles. Her background is interesting. She was at Smith College and the University of Chicago, and her work has covered a variety of areas, including altruism and moral choice, work which in fact earned her nominations for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. And she's the recipient of 2 American Political Science Association Best Book Awards, one for The Heart of Altruism from 1996, and the second for The Hand of Compassion in 2004. And she was awarded the 2010 Paul Silverman Award for Outstanding Scientific Work on Ethics. She's also been awarded the Frank Goodnow and the Ithiel de Solar-Pool Awards in 2010 for professional and service contributions. And she's also the recipient of the Sanford Award given by the International Society of Political Psychology. And she's currently this year spending the year as a fellow of Radcliffe, the Institute of Advanced Study, where she's completing a book on, sorry, my screen has disappeared. She's completing a book on Darkling Plain, which we talk about, humanity during war, and she's also, which analyses interviews with ordinary people caught up in wars and genocide to ask how people retain or regain their humanity during wars. And she has going to talk about that this afternoon. So some people write books, some people write articles, some people do both. Kristen does both, but I would like to say personally that I think that books in our field are very important, because actually books reach a wider audience than journal articles, much as we are required to and praised for writing many journal articles. When it comes to actually influencing public opinion and culture, books are very important and high impact, and I think Kristen's work has been very important in disseminating some very interesting and significant and profound ideas to our culture. So thank you very much, Kristen, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming. I wanted to start by reading a poem, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about a class that I did. Since this is an ed school, I was thinking that people would be interested in how you can combine teaching and research, and then go back and talk a little bit about the contents of the book, which I've distributed, and who the people are, and then go through a more systematic analysis of the findings, and then just kind of summarize things. So the poem I'd like to read is, can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Actually, although it would be nice for the video if you turn that microphone on, I think.
It is on.
Is it?
It is on.
Oh,
But you can,
I can hear you. Yeah.
okay, good. So this is called Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the windows, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease and then again begin, with tremulance cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breadth of the night wind down the vast edges, drear and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggles and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. So a couple years ago, I was teaching a course. I was finishing a book on ethics and moral choice during the Holocaust, and I wanted to have a chance to kind of see how it played with the class. So I thought I'd do a small seminar on this topic, and in a Reich moment, they said, well, what do you want to call it? And I said, I'll call it Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, which later did become the title of the book. I've ordered the books. I went off the summer, forgot all about everything, and came back at the end of the summer to pick up the books for the class. And the secretary in the department said, do you want to get your TA's books too? And I said, there's no TA for this course. It's a small seminar. I've never taught it before. Nobody's ever heard of it. I'll be lucky if I get 20 people. She said, Christy, the room holds 85 and there's a waiting list a mile long. They may not have heard of the course, but it's a great title. And so there I was, kind of stuck with a course, which I'd organized as a small seminar where you could work closely with people. And I had over 85 students in the class. So I decided, I don't really care. I'm going to teach it anyway. I think it's better if students get involved in topics, so that's what we did. So I taught the course as we had a lot of film, we had a lot of autobiographies. There's not a whole lot of social science work on how people keep their humanity during war, which is what I wanted the students to know, what it really feels like to go through a war. So the project that I assigned them was to go out and do an interview with someone who had lived through a war. I figured they would probably find fellow students or people their same age who'd been in the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. And instead, what I got back was a kind of incredible, just a really amazing series of things. And the whole process reminded me a little bit of Arnold's poem, because this was a class filled with students who are typical Southern California. They shorts and t-shirts and sandals and their backpacks, and they were bubbly and light and happy. And it reminded me of the kind of tranquil bay filled with the sweet night air. But underneath, the sea was very restive. Each one of these students did an interview with somebody who had really been through hell. And a lot of them were in their own families. They were not the people I had expected them to be. And I think that it really made me realize that you can bring things into a student's life and get back things that you had not expected. So I passed out the contents, and I just wanted to kind of go through them a little bit with you. Look, what I've tried to do was use titles for the book that are all quotes from somebody in the interview, so that I may have modified the quote a little bit or shortened it. So the preface is called "It's Not Glamorous." It was a very messy thing. And I think that was really symptomatic of what war was like. People didn't think it was very glamorous. The introduction is called "Making Sense of Events That Perhaps Carry None." Because people said how can you make sense out of this? They just kind of threw up their arms at things. War is hell, war is all hell is not from somebody I interviewed. That's from William Tecumseh Sherman, who was best known for his march through Georgia. And the quote actually indicates a very serious philosophy. Sherman's march to the South was designed to be horrible because it was going to bring home to the Southern people what the war was like in a real way, because the reports that they were still getting were so positive, and they were still encouraging the boys at the front. And I think you found this with World War II, that the German people were hearing, we're winning, and all of a sudden, what do you mean we lost? How can this be? So there's often a disconnect, and so I think that's what was important there. Then we had different quotes. Frank, who was an American soldier in the South Pacific, was a very interesting man. I met him, he came back to some of my classes. He had been president of Northrop Grumman Aviation, was an engineer, knew all kinds of interesting stories about people in the biotech and Silicon Valley world, and we got to know each other over the course of about 10 or 15 years. And his stories of the war reflected a kind of fatalism, which you'll see later, that fatalism it's the idea of something's going to get you, it's going to get you. And that actually had a very positive impact on people, because it meant they didn't have to worry about it. It's like, there's nothing I can do, I have no control over things, I might as well just do the best I can and not worry about it. Laura was a Holocaust survivor on Schindler's List. I met her at a play at Diary of Anne Frank. They acted, it was an opera, and then in between the singing, she was sitting on the stage and would read excerpts from her own autobiography. She would have been about the same age Anne was, had Anne lived. And her autobiography is called I Promised You a Lilac Tree, and that, you will see, is important and indicative of how the need to connect with something in the past is a very important part of your ability to survive. The man that she met who would give her extra bits of food in the camp, also a prisoner, she later married, and he said she'd had a lilac tree in her front yard in Germany before she was arrested, and she said, I promise I'll plant you a lilac tree. And so she called her autobiography that. The next person was particularly interesting to me. It was done by a kid who this was his uncle. Gunther was his uncle. All these names have been changed, of course, except when people asked to have them used. And Gunther was a refugee from an area outside of Vienna, but before that from Yugoslavia. And his family had been German. They decided to fight with the Germans. And this kid didn't know that his uncle had an SS father. He thought, he knew his father had been killed in the war. And then that Gunther's mother later married the man who became this kid's grandfather. And so he talked about the war and how bad it was and how what it was like to be a refugee. And his phrase was, everything went downhill after that. Helen mentioned the importance of books, and chapter 5 really comes because of a book. When I did The Hand of Compassion, one of the people I interviewed was a rescuer named Otto Springer, who was in Czechoslovakia, and he had a tangential relationship to the July 20th plot to kill Hitler. And he had met a woman named Mafalda, was her code name, and he was told that she had taken a coded message saying that Churchill would agree to unconditional surrender. Would agree to conditional surrender, to Stauffenberg, and that was why they went ahead with the plot. And he suspected that Mafalda was a Portuguese princess because she had a lady in waiting. He tried to track her down, he was never able to, and he died shortly after the book came out. About 2 years after the book came out, I got a phone call an email from a man named Nuno van Uden, who said, you will think this is a strange email. My son was taking a course in political science in Vienna. He read your book, and he called me, and he said, I think this is Grandma. He was the son of Mafalda, who was indeed, they called her the Red Princess. She was the sister to the heir to the Portuguese throne, and she was still alive. So one of my sons, who had been on a newspaper in UCLA, went to Portugal. He was in Europe, and he went and he did an interview with her. And it's the first time since the war that she told her family anything about what she'd done. So they'd never known. She'd always denied it. Once she was confronted with my information that Otto had given me, she fessed up. So it was very interesting. She had been a part of the 20th plot, and she was tortured by the Gestapo. The next chapter is by a man named Herb Kalman, who actually teaches here. He's a wonderful human being. And he was an Austrian Jewish refugee from the Third Reich. He got out one of the last boats that left. And he talked about the importance of belonging to something and Zionism as keeping him sane. Then we had some chapters. There were a couple of grandmothers who were American Japanese teenagers. One of the girls said her grandmother wouldn't stop talking about it. One of the girls said her grandmother didn't want to talk about it. But they both spoke about how hard it is to adjust after being through a war. So those were all from World War II. Then we had some other voices from other wars, and we had the man who is a federal judge on his 4th marriage. His daughter was in my class. She did an interview with him. He still can't talk about Vietnam. He says it's just too hard. And so obviously he's crafted a life. She said after she did the interview, and we read some literature on post-traumatic stress disorder, she said, I think my dad is suffering from PTSD. But he said best forget about Vietnam, so he would talk about other things. Then there was a South Vietnamese man who had been impressed into the South Vietnamese army, knew he would have to kill some of his relatives in the north. He was captured when the war ended, badly for the South Vietnamese. He was in a re-education camp and then escaped as a boat person, so he had some interesting things to do. And he talked about the importance of his family. I did it all for my family. Sarah, who was on the Khmer Rouge, and Kimberly, also who was imprisoned by the Khmer Rouge, One had very bitter, very angry, very bad memory, bad feelings. The other one talks very different attitude because she was with her family. She said that they told me that my family wouldn't love me, but I saw my father, and I said to him, are you still my father? And he said, yes, I'll always be your father. And they would whisper things like that to each other. Doc and Sebastian are both soldiers, American soldiers who were in the Iraq War. One of them is now in Homeland Security. This is Doc. And he said, well, there was a lot of collateral damage, but it was for the greater good. And he talked a lot about justified things by, we brought democracy to Iraq. Sebastian has no justification at all. He said, it's just easily the worst experience of my life. So I'd never go back there again. Finally, we come to civil wars and genocides, some dictators and domestic oppressors. And the first person that really blew my mind was a young woman who came in with her great-grandmother, who must be one of the few people who was still alive from the Armenian genocide, 1917, 1919. She was 6 at the time. She refused to talk much about it, but she did describe seeing her grandfather have his head cut off, and she had saved the Bible, which was soaked in his blood. And her great-granddaughter talked a lot about how the grandmother had lived her life and dealt with things. Gucci is a very well-known writer. He's often spoken of as a possible Nobel laureate from Africa. He was born into a family where they had many wives and several brothers on different sides of the Mau Mau rebellion. And he wrote the first book. He was arrested because he was teaching plays in Kikiyu instead of in Swahili or English. And while he was in prison, they would give you a pencil if you would write a letter saying why you were there, kind of your guilt. And so he took toilet paper at night, and he wrote the first book published in Kikiyu on toilet paper at night. So, very interesting man. Fabiola was a daughter of someone who was high up. He was a university professor, an engineer, and because of that, he got into the Sandinista government as Department of Water and Sewers. And she was trying to escape with her mother and sister. They had a car. Their town was being bombarded. And she talks about getting stuck in the mud in the middle of a civil war. This mysterious young man comes out of the jungle with carrying a rifle on his back and helps them get the car out, puts some traction under the wheels, and then the mother is grateful, offers him a ride, and as they're riding along, they realize that he has some kind of badge he's flashing when they go through the checkpoints, and that he must be a Sandinista. And of course, the mother is hoping that the little daughters will not say anything about Daddy being in the Somoza government. So then there was a wonderful woman who went through the Lebanese Civil War, and a man who was in Idi Amin's Uganda. And his daughter, I still remember the presentation, she had filmed it, and she said, "Hi, Dad," up there. She said he never talked about his experiences with her at all. She never understood why he sent so much money to Uganda. And she said after the interview she did understand it. And the last two, there was someone who was in Afghanistan under the Soviets, which I thought was how Afghanistan brought in. That was not the way I expected it to be. And then there was a woman whose husband was chief of police for a large city in Iran, and they left when the Islamic Khomeini came back in. And she was very articulate. She was a university professor, and they edited some of her books by just ripping out random pages because they didn't like what she was doing. And her identity as a teacher and as a parent were what really clicked in for her. So those are some of the people that we interviewed. And let me just, the students did the interviews themselves. We went through IRB training, which was fun. And they were just told to ask 3 questions. One was, tell us about the war you lived through, which is more prompts than anything else. Tell us about the moral choices the war presented you, and then tell us what you did that you thought helped you keep your humanity or put it back together after you. So those were the only things that they actually asked people. They were told that they were supposed to just let the conversation kind of go where it wanted to. They were certainly not ever supposed to push people on things if they thought it was difficult. And since so many of them were actually related to the people, it became a very interesting experience. So I'm not going to go through the literature review because I think that would be too long. What happened is that I asked the students when I saw these papers, I did these make a wonderful book, if anybody wants to work on it with me, let me know. And there were 2 students who did want to work on it, and then I have a summer internship every summer at the Ethics Center, and we had a couple students there who wanted to work on it. So we put it together, and that's how we did it. So we kind of did things a little backwards. We didn't really have we didn't go through a literature search to see what we were going to find out. We kind of had these interesting data. We had to try to figure out what explained those, and then had to try to get the context. And I was very disappointed. Most of the political science literature is just non-existent. We don't talk about it. We talk about wars are talked about in geopolitical terms, strategy, justifications, but very little discussion about the big themes. It seems to be more falls to poets and fiction and great pieces of literature. Okay, what are the things that we found did help people? Well, one of the first ones was the kind of basic Freudian will to survive. Even if that meant jeopardizing some of your prior moral constraints. That was a key factor for a lot of people. So one of the Khmer Rouge survivors said, "I didn't want to die. You lied so that you were able to survive." Another Khmer Rouge survivor said, "You try to cope and sleep. You just have enough energy to get up when they tell you to get up." And a survivor of the Nicaraguan Civil War said, "I had to stay strong. I knew I just had to." Second factor that seemed to be important was luck. And a lot of, is it luck? Is it individual personality? How does the environment come into things? People like Adler and Bettelheim talk about this. And a lot of people talked about the importance of luck, both for survival and for the preservation of their humanity. Laura Hillman, who was the person who was on Schindler's List, if any of you saw the movie, Goff, the guy who was played by Ralph Fiennes, was a sadistic concentration camp guard. And he had a mistress who was on the 3rd floor of a home, and Laura was young. She had to carry hot water up from the basement. They didn't have running water. And the woman was just nasty, and she would always complain about Laura was too slow. And so once the commandant took her, threw the boiling water on her and kicked her down the stairs. And she said if she had broken something, he just would have pulled out the shotgun and shot her. And she says she doesn't know who put her name on the list. She thinks it was he, but in checking back, I don't think that can have been, because I think he was already arrested at this time. Anyway, that was how she survived. But she said it was luck. She said, "Students ask me, how come you stayed alive when your family and 6 million did not? I can never give an answer to that. Why? I don't know myself. I didn't know. It was a set of circumstances. It was luck. It was where I stood at a given time." But closely related to luck was, and something noted by a lot of other survivors, was fatalism. The only way you can handle a major stressful thing like war is to become fatalistic. It was the way to survive, to get through it. In other words, it was pure chance. So luck and fatalism are very closely related here. And I think the fatalism, which the soldier, Frank, notes, is very complex. I tried to figure out what was happening here. Frank said it was fatalism. It was, if something's going to get you, it'll get you. If it's not, it will not. And I think this is the way it works. It means that the bad was a result of random chance, and it shouldn't be taken personally. Fatalism also reduced, I think, Frank's need to worry. If you don't have any control over anything, then you don't have the stress. You recognize this, and you give up the stress which comes from feeling you have control over something that you really don't, and you feel you're responsible for something. So I think fatalism was very interesting, but a lot of people had it. A woman named Grace said, there wasn't much anything anybody could do. You just had to do what you had to do. What could we have done? There's nothing. And Sebastian, as a young, one of the soldiers who was in Iraq, was very negative on the war, said, I was really afraid. The way I managed dealing with that kind of stress was debilitating, sitting there thinking, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. So it was like, F it, I'm already dead. So I can just stop worrying about that and just worry about what I have to do. And that tended to be the attitude that a lot of people had. Even the girl who was from Nicaragua said, even though I was just 11 years old, the coping mechanism I used was to tell myself that death would not be that bad after all. I saw death as a release from the turmoil around me and saw that if my family and I were to die, then perhaps it would not be as bad. And that was a little bit slightly different aspect of fatalism, just shaping, accepting it though. Beyond that, another thing that was really important was the kind of sense of self and a sense of continuity. If you saw yourself as a survivor rather than as a victim, it seemed to have a big impact on people. speakers who saw themselves as survivors did much better than those who felt beaten by the events. I think that particularly it helped to maintain their sense of agency, that they really could have some control in it. A young woman named Kimberly, who was imprisoned by the Khmer Rouge, credits her parents, for example, said, "We remain who we are regardless of what's inflicted on us." And she said, "My parents said, let's live day by day. We won't forget who we are, and we won't let anything take away from who we are. Even though we're living in the water or in a shack, we are still who we are." And that was very important to her because the Khmer Rouge were trying to sever the ties that she had to her family. Next thing that seemed to be important in terms that related very closely to identity, and that was feeling that you were part of something which was larger than you were. They noticed before that people during the concentration camp who were political prisoners or who people, Jehovah's Witnesses, tended to do very well in surviving more than other groups did. And they could never quite figure out why. And I think one of the explanations is that they understood they were part of something bigger. And we can see this very interesting in Herb Kelman, who was very articulate, spent most of his life trying to understand conflict based on this kind of prejudice. And he was the refugee I mentioned from Austria. From all sorts of points of view, the Zionist group, he and his sister belonged to a Zionist group. His sister was older and she kind of got him into it. But he said, that Zionist group made this actually a good experience, despite the fact that we were poor, our future was uncertain, and all of these things. This Zionist group was very important for all sorts of reasons. Perhaps most important, it buffered my self-esteem in such a way that the whole part of the experience, not the Holocaust at that time, not my whole Nazi experience, none of this threatened my self-esteem in any way. And I think this was really important. I think the fact that it neutralized, the fact that you had decided to choose something, and that because of that, you were part of something bigger than yourself, it kind of neutralized the ability of the oppressors to oppress you and to make you feel that you had no control. In Herb's case, I think he quite explicitly said it was a very powerful antidote to the anti-Semitism that was all around it. Beyond that, though, I think family was very important for pretty much everybody. Your family is there no matter what's going to happen. We don't sell our family out. That's the most valuable message to try to send. No matter what or who you become, your family will be there for you. It's a quote from Kimberly. There were other things. There were neighbors that were often important, but for most people it was family. Tuan, who was the Vietnamese who had been in an education camp, when he got out, his wife and he had one small child, and they tried to escape on the boat and were turned back. And then they decided they would try again. He would go by himself. And it's very interesting because we'll talk a little later about hope, but he said, I knew I had to do this, and he went off on a boat. They didn't know where they were going. They drifted for about a week. There was one of the children on the boat died. They were waiting for the other child to die so they could throw him overboard in the same spot. They were finally picked up by a boat and taken to Indonesia, and they were there for a while. And he went through incredible things, and he said, I really did this all for my family. Our nuclear family remained intact. That was probably the major thing that made it okay. Hope was an interesting factor, and ordinarily you think hope works in the following way, that if you have hope, you can survive. If you think, well, the Americans are coming soon, they're going to liberate me, or the war will be over soon, or something like that. And there was a lot of that. The hope for a better future always kept me going. It was something that helped me recover. It was my own sanity. This is a quote from a man named Luis who went through the El Salvador War. My family was always my concern. I wanted a better future for them, not in El Salvador, which was too dangerous for us to live in anymore. We needed to be in a better place. And Tuan described the period in education camp, re-education, as the worst part of it for him, because he said you never knew what was going to happen. If his wife would come and he would show emotion, they might cause him to say, well, you're going to add more days on because you haven't been properly socialized. So he then talked about how the lack of hope during that period, the feeling that there was nothing that could be possibly worse than what he had, the kind of hopelessness that he had, made him attempt the impossible, which was escaping. And so hope also played a negative, and you could see this in a lot of people who lived through the Holocaust. that they kept thinking, well, the Germans won't do this to us. You know, I was a soldier during World War I. I was the Medal of Honor person. I'm fully German. I'm not really Jewish, and so they kept thinking that it wouldn't happen to them because they had hope that things would get better. And it was ironically sometimes the people who gave up the hope and said, this is hopeless, I'm going to get out, I'm going to try anything. So hope worked different ways. Another interesting concept that we found was what I call cognitive stretching. It's kind of the capacity to recognize that the world has changed. One of the men who was involved in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler had been was a man named Axel von den Busche, who had agreed to strap bombs to himself. He was a young, kind of attractive, you know, very Germanic-looking lieutenant, and Hitler and I think Goebbels and Goering were supposed to come and inspect a factory that had new uniforms. And he went to his father and told about telling his father what he was going to do, and he said, you know, I'll be killing the Fuhrer. And the father said, I understand. And then he said, I'll be killed too. And his father said, I understand. So he'd agreed to do this, and then the British bombed the factory the weekend before they were supposed to come. They canceled the visit. He got sent to the Eastern Front, was injured, so he was one of the people that was in the hospital. Nobody told about his name, and so he survived the war. But he talked about his decision to get involved in this, and he said he was on the Eastern Front, and they came in and reported that there was some kind of incident going on, that there were people being led up a hill and then machine gunned, and so they kept cabling back to orders at headquarters saying, give us orders to go in and put this down, we don't know what's happening. And the orders were, don't do nothing, just stay where you are. And he said, when he realized what happens, at that moment, the bottom drops out of everything. And you realize the world is a very different place in a kind of emotional way that you didn't realize intellectually before. And he said, everything stretches and you have to decide how you're going to do it. So I think that was very important in people's ability to stretch cognitively, to realize what was happening during the war, and that would allow them to prepare and anticipate in some way emotionally, that they could then respond differently. They weren't in shock. Okay, so I talked earlier about a link to a previous life, and I mentioned Laura Hillman meeting a young man in camp who gave her extra food, who said he would plant her a lilac tree afterwards. This was very important. A lot of people talked about similar things. There are a lot of studies of children in London who were evacuated during the Blitz who actually didn't do as well as some of the children who stayed with their parents because the lack of continuity upset them more. Now, of course, if you were killed, that was a different problem. So there were a lot of coping mechanisms that we found that people used. One of the things we found was that some people wanted to talk about it, kind of the classic therapeutic way, reliving it, help free you of it. A lot of people wanted to close a door, put a do not disturb sign on their memory. And people coped quite differently. The student who interviewed her great-grandmother said, at the end of her interview, an aspect of Rose I picked up on very quickly was her strong suppression of the event I was interviewing her about. Rose has found a way to deal with these atrocities committed to her, and that is simply by not talking about them. She helped maintain her humanity by presenting a front of being strong. Forgetting the war constituted a central part of recovery for her, as it did for a lot of other people. I do my best to forget about Vietnam, Chris said to his daughter. And Frank captured this sentiment from many speakers. We just didn't talk about the war. It was one of those things you repress. That's how you cope with it. And he told me the night we did an interview with him, he said, I'd probably talk more about the war tonight than any other time. I don't know if any of you have family who went through the war, but I realized my father was in the war. He never talked about it. We'll talk about that a little later. Then we have some very difficult mechanisms of coping to deal with: survivor guilt, blame, and how you conceive happiness. I really didn't have a good handle on these. It was very difficult to see how they played out, and I think it would be very interesting to broaden the database a little bit and have more interviews. But what Frank said, kind of summarized it up, when you begin to understand is that things are not just straightforward, and there are these other interrelationships. I didn't completely understand at the moment why these things went on, but when you become older and more mature, you could look back and see what really had gone on and why these things occurred. So I think what Frank seemed to do, and it was typical of a lot of people we interviewed, he seemed to draw on his sense of fatalism to find some kind of meaning in the events that happened to him, even when those events were as terrible and gruesome as World War II. His fatalism, I think, was a kind of shield against the bitterness that can come from both feeling guilty and from being consumed by blame. And I could see this in the two young girls who were imprisoned by the Khmer Rouge. One was totally bitter. I hate them. She got quite emotional and saying, why don't they're having trials. The trials aren't any good. They need to be treated like they treated us. But I think by Frank's kind of stepping back and feeling fatalistic about it, that seemed to free him to go on and build a life which was happy and meaningful afterwards. But I don't have real good handle on those things. So okay, let me just try to kind of sum up a little bit. One of the interesting things about narratives is how you deal with what isn't said. What does the silences mean? I think a lot of times people do not comment on what is commonplace, what is ordinary, what they assume is the norm. And I think that's one of the things that we found, is that how you interpret the silences is very, very interesting to me. If you step back and try to, at the end of a project, look at the forest for the trees, as you will, I think it's very interesting. You found very little of the swashbuckling jingoism that you see in something like Gone with the Wind, where there's a scene in the movie, and I haven't read the book, I'm proud to say, but there's a scene at the beginning of the movie where they're all racing off to glory, and they want to get there and get in before the war is over, because they're sure they're going to win it. I have read All Quiet on the Western Front, and there's a lot of that too. It's like, the war is coming, we got to go off, we got to save the war. Very little of that. Nobody talks about that. There's no idea, well, I had to get in there before the call to glory was over. Nobody talked about anybody like Roosevelt talking about a day of infamy. There are no calls to glory. Instead, we find, again, quotes like, people stuck in the middle of the mud in the Civil War, of wars that easily constitute the worst experiences of their lives, of people who describe themselves as having seen too much, who carry bad memories, bad feelings, and live the rest of their lives as damaged goods, not happy heroes. And at best, you find collateral damage rarely being justified. There's only one person that even talked about this at all in kind of justification for the war, and that was the man who is now in Homeland Security, which is interesting. And I think it's interesting for me, because going into this as a social scientist and realizing that a lot of the best insight from war comes from people like Sophocles or Steinbeck's The Moon is Down, or some of the books or even the movies that are, Deer Hunter, things like that. But what is the role that social science can do? And I think one thing that social science can do here is to give a voice to other people. I think when you are a literary person, you have a point that you're trying to make. You create characters, you give them voice, but it's you. And I think that as a social scientist who's trying to strive for objectivity and a sort of detached, fair neutrality, we know we never get it, but we at least try for it. I think that that's one of the things that strikes me, that as you listen to the stories, which really were gathered rather randomly, I just sent the students out to do something, we're really struck by their contrast with the many books on wars, which are written by policymakers, the old men who start the wars. Such books frequently entail a justification for the wars that the protagonists began, or at least that they ratified or colluded in. If you think of all the McNamara Fog of War, if you think of, Dick Cheney, who had, 7 deferments and then sends everybody off to fight in Iraq. With the exception of one person, Doc, in this book, we find none of this here. Virtually every person in the book emphasizes the negatives of war. So if you step back and look at the forest that they describe, it's deep, it's dark, it's primordial, it's dangerous. There are no soldiers cheering, no crowds exalting, none of the, nothing like that. The speakers really reach out to us, and I think that they're trying to, they're full of revulsion at what they've seen, and they really wanted to suppress the memory of it. One of the men who was at the Battle of the Bulge, which was one of the last horrible battles of the war, described World War II, described being in a foxhole with his buddy, and the Americans they didn't have the kind of equipment the Germans had. The Germans were hoses, they were freezing, and he said the buddy was wounded, and the buddy was begging him to kill him, and he said, I can't do that. And so the buddy took the instruments they had and was trying to kill himself, hit him off over the head. They had no more bullets. And he said when the sun came up, the foxhole was, the buddy was dead and everything was covered with blood. And he said the enormity of it all tended to reduce everything else in life to a kind of footnote. And I think that was one thing that struck me, that they want to go back to the blessed mundane of the everyday, away from the kind of experience which is so searing that the enormity of it all reduces everything else to a kind of footnote. And so that, I think, is the most important thing that I took away from this, that I think a lot of the books on war really, there's an awful lot of glorification and justification that we have. And I don't think that's what it is for the people who are on the ground. So, that's it.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Now I turn for commentary to one of our doctoral students, Michelle Bellino, who herself has been doing some very, very relevant work on actually the aftermath of war, perhaps war in itself. So I'll leave you to introduce yourself and to comment. So, Michelle.
Thanks. Do you want me to stay here or move?
Are you on camera?
Yeah, no, you're not. So could you?
Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't you put this on
Swap
too?
spots? Okay.
Well, don't swap. Just sit
Or
next to it.
just-
So
yeah.
you stay there,
We can be
Kristen, and she
neighbors.
can sit
Okay,
in.
I'll just get the chair here.
Okay.
Great. Well, I'm happy to be here discussing Kristen's work, not only as Helen said, because it's tremendously useful to me in my own research on post-war transitions, but also because she asks some really deep questions in this work about what it means to be human when we are tested or pushed to our limits.
It's hard to see.
I always have to do this anyway in any room I'm in.
I didn't think about
I didn't know
that.
I could do that, but. So for about 2 weeks, I've known that I would be here today to discuss Kristen's work, and so when I sat down to this task of preparing my remarks, it was difficult to filter out our recent collective experience here in Boston. In the aftermath of the marathon bombings, we all seemed to cling to.
Turn this on so I'm coming.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
That's
Not
okay.
usually the technician.
No. Thank you. Okay,
Thanks,
so.
Kristen.
In the aftermath of the marathon bombings, as we all seem to cling to our news outlets and online social networks for information, one of the things that struck me was the number of reports that emphasized Boston's strength amidst crisis. And I kept hearing this pattern, so I thought I would just present really briefly 2 examples. President Obama spoke of the big-hearted people of Boston who offered stories of heroism and kindness, resolve and resilience, generosity and love. He said if anyone wants to know who we are, what America is, how we respond to evil and terror, that's it, selflessly, compassionately, and unafraid. And later in an email that our university president, Drew Faust, wrote to the community, which I'm not sure if you received, Kristen, she wrote, "Many have noted examples of the extraordinary goodness that these terrible events have paradoxically generated. Even as we confront the horror of what humans can do, we see as well the majesty of what people can be, as they take risks and make efforts for others and for something beyond themselves. We must not forget that human capacity during what will be difficult days and weeks to come. The trauma of this violence so close to home will not quickly fade. It will affect each one of us in ways we must face together. Times like these test our resilience and call forth our humanity." So clearly, Kristen's work speaks to this perceived duality in human behavior as she explores the coping mechanisms and survival strategies that individuals cite as essential to maintaining their humanity during times of war, as well as in its aftermath. And I'm not sure which is a more incredible feat, to find a way to care for others amidst mass destruction and suffering, or to build anew with the wounds of war still stinging. To some extent, both seem to be darkling plains. In addition to the contributions that her book makes to political and moral psychology and theories of moral decision-making, there are at least 3 reasons for me why this book stands out as more than the intrigue of its concluding set of 6 psychological dimensions associated with maintaining humanity. And the first is that it's cross-cultural. The stories this work draws on span from the early 20th century to the recent Iraq War, covering experiences with various types of mass violence and destruction, cutting across particular group experiences in search of understanding what it is to be humane and human during war. The second is her decision to include experiences of various types of actors, including trained soldiers and unarmed civilians, taking seriously the lives that these stories represent, as well as the diversity of wartime experience. And from what I've read of the book, the narrative voice is really consistently down to earth and sensitive, so I think, like Helen was saying, it would really appeal to a wide audience, which is a great accomplishment in the research world. And the third is the evolution of the book itself, which I was really glad to hear you speak about, how it grew from Kristen's collaboration with her students and student researchers and connected an intellectual community with a wider social community of people who have suffered, struggled, and survived, and those seeking to make sense of their experiences. And I imagine that each of those dimensions of the work also presented methodological challenges for you, such as how to build an analysis that went beyond one individual voice, one memory, one type of conflict, one time and place. So at this point, I'd like to turn to some of my questions for you. I have three sort of big, beefy questions. The first is, how did you decide to search for humanity across such a wide spectrum of experience? Now, on this point, I'm specifically referring to your decision about which voices to include in the collection. So armed soldiers and civilian victims are differentially prepared for war, differentially supported during war, and receive differential treatment after war. The range here is immense, from actors who might be considered heroes or criminals, those acting in support of state aggression, or citizens targeted by their home state, actors who served their national military by traveling to distant places, or those who woke to their village in flames, their people in exile, and of course everything that lies in between. And so I wonder, does it always make sense to extract something universal from experiences that emerge from such diverse social and political locations, as well as active and less active decisions about participation in war? So do you distinguish between protective or adaptive strategies across groups at any point, or do you have any sense of whether this might yield an interesting pattern? Is it possible, for example, that survivors who were victims during war have different strategies than those who were members of the armed forces, or that there might be something we could learn from grouping individual experiences during war this way? My second question centers on what I believe are the most counterintuitive of your findings, namely that fatalism and losing hope, or letting go, traditionally viewed as negative experiences, seemed to serve some positive function in these extreme contexts. So I have to admit, I'm still really baffled by these findings, and I wonder what to make of them in the context where I work, which is post-war Guatemala, where rates of social and political violence remain incredibly high. And so this is the context I'm coming in with. And in my work, young Guatemalans often speak about feeling powerless to change their lives. They seem to cling to fatalistic claims that life will not get any better for them, and they have intense arguments with one another about whether hoping is a risk, given their grim circumstances. So in the moment of instability and injustice that they are experiencing, these acts of letting go do not seem to be helping them. And on a collective level, I worry that attitudes about hopelessness seem to be very harmful. Powerlessness, hopelessness, and fatalism are also linked to violence. We know that they can be drivers of violence. So I suppose I'm unsure just what to do with this tension. And it makes me wonder whether something like fatalism is being retrospectively positioned as a useful strategy for survival, whereas at the time of suffering, these acts of resignation may have actually felt like a giving up of one's humanity. My last question is somewhat related. I'm curious if you've given any thought about the potential policy implications for your findings or practice implications. I don't imagine that you envision a crisis or emergency intervention that teaches fatalism and instructs people to lose hope so that they might be better equipped to maintain their humanity. But where might these 6 dimensions lead us in terms of wartime and post-war interventions, as well as programs aimed at violence prevention? Can any of these strategies be taught, or should they? And I lied, I have a bonus question. Since we're a small audience, I think I'll throw it in. It's sort of a meta question. I'm curious whether you think that studying these wars and moral choices affected the moral development of your own students. So that's it. You don't have to answer all these. These are just sort of to get us all sort of thinking together. So thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. I know I'm leaving you with a lot, but it comes from a place of sincere interest, and I look forward to an interesting discussion to follow. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome, yeah.
Well, I think they're very interesting questions, Kristen. Do you want to face some of them at least?
Sure, yeah, and I'm
Yes.
happy to. It's,
It's back to
flip it
you.
back, yes.
I
I
turned
think
it off,
because
so I
they're
turned it
quite a
back
small
on.
group, I think if people
I
feel they want to
move
chip in at any point. Stay there, Michelle. That's it. That's Jesus. Because
Well,
remember,
that's-
you're on the camera, so it's like you
Yeah, put it underneath.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
fine. Well, thank you very much for your comments. They're all good questions. Let me try to ask them in the order you raised them for me. How did I decide to search for the different voices? I think Louis Pasteur said that chance favors the prepared mind, and that's the best I can say for myself in this. I had no intention of doing this book. I just thought it would be interesting to see what, and I wanted the kids to have a good experience, and I think that, when I started my career, I used to do these great lectures, and they were all, well prepared, and they hung together, and sometimes they went over, sometimes they went around, never knew when they actually went in, so I've moved much more to making students, go in and do research themselves, because I think that really has a big impact on them. And I was just kind of blown away by the range of and the quality of the relations that they got. I do think that they affected the students very profoundly. I'd done another course where I had students do some writing about it, and they had to do an interview. This was on the politics of difference, and we looked not initially at the usual differences in the United States with race or religion or ethnicity, but at age, because age is one where you can see how easily the ethical aspects of it. The whole thing is in some ways socially, constructed so that nobody's born old, nobody wants to be old, everybody does want to be old. What does it mean to be old? And so they had to do an interview with somebody in their family, and the kids came back and they would tell me these amazing things, like one girl was asking her grandmother to do an interview as they were going out to go shopping, and the grandmother got so excited she ran over the mailbox. And another one, the grandmother called her girl's mother and was crying and said, I didn't know anybody in the family loved me that much. And I think something similar happened here, that the students had to write an analysis of the interview. They did the interview and then they had to analyze it. And so the one where, just to pick one at random, Sebastian, who was a guy that the student in the class knew from the fraternity, and he said, at the end of the interview, he said, this person is the most social, wonderful, humane person I've ever met, and yet he sees himself as really damaged by this. So I think that the students did have a very strong impact, and one of the things I didn't talk about, which I talk about in the book, is the importance of doing an interview with somebody you know and care about. I think that has a much stronger impact than if you go and do an interview with a stranger. And I was very lucky when I started doing my interviews. I had no idea, I had no training in it. I was trained in survey research and econometrics, and I ended up doing interviews with altruists who were older people. And A, they were wonderful, and B, they were old and they had lots of time. And I got really close to a lot of them. I still keep ties with them. So I think that the interviews, I think, are very important particularly if there's a close tie, or if you let yourself form a close tie with people. We're often told to be objective. I'm not sure that has such value. I think there's some other things. She has to pick up a child from school.
I know she has it.
Yeah, we just communicated.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. I'll follow up by email. I'm so sorry to leave. It's fascinating.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Children are important. You raise a question, can you derive something universal from the different groups? I don't know. I think you'd want to have a bigger data set, and I think it would be interesting to see how, in my own work, I've done work on people who were rescuers, bystanders, and perpetrators during war, and there were certainly different patterns of response there. I don't think we just have enough data yet. One of the things I want to do is set up an archive, which I'm having trouble with the Institutional Review Board letting me do this, where people in other courses, I'd like the book to be used in courses in international relations so that it gives a different side to it. At the beginning of each chapter, where I think some of the chapters I passed out were El Salvador War, I'll just describe a little bit what the war was like. And then, but it's the human aspect that I want people to know about. And I think if we can get an archive where people in other courses in other different universities do it, you can begin to do that kind of analysis. So I don't know. I mean, I was trained as a social scientist to try to think in broad themes, so that's how I look. But I think this is very preliminary work. Do we have different survival strategies according to the group? Probably. I don't know. That's again, I could see some. I mean, I only had a couple soldiers in Iraq, but those two had very different survival strategy. One did it all in his own head. This is for the greater good. We're bringing democracy. Therefore, it's okay. The other felt guilty. We gave away most of his salary to the Iraqi family he was living with, and brought things from home. So they had very different survival strategies. The counterintuitive findings, yeah, those were interesting to me. I don't know what to make of them. I mean, I have a kind of respect for data, and I think you have to call it as it is. You don't know what's going on. There's a story that Leon Walras, who was a very famous economist in the 19th century in England, noticed some kind of a relationship between the harvest and the economic downturn, and sunspots. And he published a paper saying there's a strong correlation, and it practically ruined his reputation. Now, of course, we can understand the link. And the sunspots affect weather, which affects the harvest, which affects blah, blah, blah. So I think you have a responsibility to say what you see in the data, hope that somebody else will figure out, someone like you, who comes along with ask different questions. I think counterintuitive findings are really important because they can sometimes point you in a different direction. I mean, all the work I've done on altruism is something that can't be explained through the model of self-interest. And by looking at that deviant case, if you will, that helps you understand the limitations of the model. So that's what I think is important about counterintuitive findings, because they don't make sense, but it can help you understand broader theories like powerlessness and fatalism often do lead to violence. Well, when are the situations when it does and when doesn't it? So if you're interested in the Guatemalan case, that would be an interesting finding to pick up. Here, this is what the usual literature says. This one, finding says such and such. Devise some way you can talk to people and just listen to them, what they say, and maybe, you'll be able to advance something in that area. So I think that's very interesting. Practical strategies. No, I have none. I have no idea if there's anything. I think all you can do is try to get people to think more carefully about things. And does studying this help your students? Yes, I think it really did. The course was much more interesting. I had people come up and say, write things at the end of the exam, like one boy said, I'm a graduating senior, I've already been accepted to law school, I don't care about my grade, this is the best course I ever had, I really love it. So things like that, I take it as a case. One girl said that she had been partying and drinking a lot. She said, I just took this course because I thought it sounded like a fun title. And she said, halfway through the course, you said something, there was somebody I was talking about, and I described what this person had. I guess this woman said, we always have times in our life when we should have done something and we didn't, and it gets in the way in the rest of your life. And then she said, you said it's never too late. And she said it was like somebody opened a door for me. Mm-hmm. And so she heard this person that, somebody else had described, not her. And she said, I don't drink and I don't party anymore, I've gotten serious. So that's nice to think that there can be things like that. So.
Right. Kristen, that's fantastic. So it's a small but select audience, so have you got things you want to ask her? I certainly have. You didn't introduce yourself, you came in late. What's your name?
I'm Marlena.
Yes. Where are you from?
I'm a graduate student at the Divinity School.
Oh, right. Would any of you like to comment or contribute thoughts to the questions that Kristen's raised and Michelle has raised on top of it? Alan, yes.
We tend to think of evil as something that can actually be identified, defined, and eradicated. But history tells us otherwise. And I think the problem is that it comes in an endless variety of forms, endless definitions, and also in endless numbers of places. It's sort of like it's like an endemic disease. You never really can get rid of it. It sort of waxes and wanes. It makes its appearance in a number of different ways, in a number of different places. And there's really no way to eradicate it. It's just sort of a fact of life. Of course, it's balanced by positive things as well. So it may be what I call, it's an existential condition. Not a good thing to have, but there you have it. And you sort of react to it as best you can, usually in sort of a circumstantial way. When you have to make a very specific decisions, as often happens between two warring parties. But one of the sensible rules is that between warring parties, the rule is you do not intentionally target civilians. Of course, that's what happens all the time. But if that kind of belief was sort of inculcated, you know, in the warring parties, that we sort of promise not to attack and target civilians. We can't guarantee it, but that's our intention, and we do our best. And if that can elicit some kind of response by the other warring party, you may make some progress in terms of reducing what we call like collateral damage or something, but you're never going to eliminate it entirely.
I think the question of civilian damage is interesting. This is the Sherman quote, which is contra what you're saying. It's suggesting that if you have armies in the, I mean, your view is you have armies in the field and they kind of go out very much like the 19th century war, and they fight with each other and they don't hurt the civilians. But Sherman's view is exactly the contrary, which is that there's a supportive community at home, which is cheering these guys on and giving them supplies, and that if you have the community at home that cuts it off, that realizes that they too are suffering, that you bring the war home to the people on the home front, as you will, that then that will end the war. And that was very much what you saw happening in Vietnam, in this country. That's what he was doing in the march towards the sea. And I think this has been incorporated in kinds of in the nuclear age. I remember in graduate school reading an article by Henry Kissinger written shortly before he became Nixon's National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State, and there were the stages towards nuclear annihilation. And it was like stage 4, I mean, there were like 20 stages, and in stage 3, you know, they took out one of your major cities and you took out 2 of theirs to show you were serious. And I'm thinking, what the heck happens at stage 17? You know, and partly that was the second strike capability that Albert Walsh did, or, you know, was Paul Wolfowitz's mentor, that they developed, that you have to make people know that war is going to cost them. It's not something that is going to be free of harm to the home front. And so I think that the attitude that civilians are off limit, that this is sort of a gentlemanly enterprise, is very much a 19th century thing. I don't think it's something we do now. I mean, the drones, which is, you know, the kind of, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but that's certainly one of the high-tech things. It's just, you know, we're not going to get killed. We're just playing a video game, and we just blow up, you know, their buildings, and if there are some people, well, that happens. So I think there's a movement away from that.
Yes, I was intrigued by, I was kind of intrigued by the thing that Michelle raised about, you know, what actually I think is sometimes called learned helplessness, but this, that you reduce stress by feeling powerless. I don't find that so difficult to understand, because we know that there are various mechanisms that we use to reduce pressure, and one of them is to sort of switch off parts of our information flow. And I think that the kind of thing you're describing there is a sense of you know, if I switch down the systems that are going to be responding, then I'm minimizing the cost to myself. So it's sort of like, I mean, our bodies do shut down certain systems as a defense, and I think there's sort of a massive shutdown of what otherwise be totally overwhelmed with pain. I think that's what's happening. It's a numbness that that protects us, and it's of course very wide-ranging in this case.
I don't know if it's numbness so much as a letting go.
Well, that was numbness, but yes, letting go. It's powerlessness. It's I can do nothing, so all the mechanisms I would normally have to respond and do something
Right.
switched down. It's not numb, it's a system shut down, basically, almost.
Well, I think when you use the word learned helplessness, I think it has a kind of pejorative context to it. I'm just thinking of like the Serenity prayer, Lord.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Lord,
Well, I
help
can't
me
do
to
this.
change the things I can't change,
That's right,
not
yes.
sin and wisdom to
Mm.
know the difference between the two. And I think that's the same psychological process phrased in a more positive way, I
Mm.
think. And I think that is something that you want to think about, and it's a very complex question because, of course, you don't want people to get inured to feeling that they can't do anything.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it was interesting with me, I was reading during the communist period in Eastern Europe, all these Eastern European novels I would read were heavily into sex and things. I think, of course, they didn't have any control over anything else in their lives, and so it's a very narrow world that you're focusing in. And then when you get out of that, how do you deal with a different situation? I think that was one of the things that I would like to have more insight on is how people kind of put it together afterwards. And sometimes people would talk about it, sometimes they didn't talk about it. I mean, the woman who did the interview with her father, who was a federal judge, said he's on his fourth, I think he's about ready to marry the fourth woman. My mother was like his third wife or something. And she said he keeps himself so busy, he's always doing work for the UN, he's always flying here and there, he just doesn't want to think about things.
Right.
And I know I did that when my brother was dying of cancer. I took on an extra course because I did not want to have to be alone. What academics do is you sit in a room and you write and you think, and I did not want to think. I wanted to be with people every minute I possibly could because thinking about what was happening was just too painful for me. So I think, to me, I have a tremendous respect and admiration for the human mind and how the human psyche responds to these things. And, I don't think I would ever tell people who are, not wanting to talk about something that they had to talk about. I know a lot of the people I interviewed when I did the work on the Holocaust were people that were telling me their stories in 1990, for the first time. They hadn't told people before. They were at talk stage and they were at the end of their lives. They were very conscious of it. And I was a stranger coming in. It was easier to talk with a stranger, much easier. I ended up doing interviews on the telephone because I had a baby that was about a year old and I couldn't travel around the world and do interviews. And I think that also actually, ironically, helped me get different. Yeah, it was a distancing. I mean, I would pass some of these people on the street. I don't know them. They don't know what I look like. But they opened up. They were very revealing about things. And one man, his wife called later and said, I would keep in touch with people, and she said, he has cancer and he won't talk about it with any of us. Would you call him? And I would call him, maybe once a month or two. And I called and said, hi, how's everything going? Oh, fine. And I said, how's everybody in the family? Oh, fine. And I said, well, that's good. I'm glad to know. There's nothing bad going on. And he said, well, I got a little news. He said, I have cancer. And I said, I'm sorry, and asked him to talk about it. And he talked a little bit. And the next day she called me back and said he got off the phone with you and he started to talk with us. So it's like a total stranger. It's someone who you could talk about important things. So I think that it's interesting to me how the human mind deals with these things. We'll tell some stranger, not just a shrink, but sometimes somebody on the bus, we see something we don't want to tell someone near us. It's very interesting.
Sometimes distance becomes a kind of substitute for confidentiality.
Yeah.
It has that feel about it, because you're talking to, over the phone with a disembodied voice. And
well, this is a psychoanalytic thing. You're
Yeah.
supposed to lie down and not look at the guy.
Right, yeah.
You just, free associate.
Of course, you talk to strangers on trains, you suddenly find after half an hour of conversation with pour out your soul that they actually went out with your sister 10 years ago or something.
Yeah, I
They
know.
lived down the road or whatever. So-
That's a problem.
But I think this is serious. I think these are, you're raising extremely interesting issues, and I hope that they get a lot of wide coverage. I mean, your point about the fact that none of the people except, even the Homeland Security person is a kind of defensive reaction, even though it was sort of sounded positive. I mean, in order for people to go to war, you have to persuade them by various forms of seduction and bribery and blackmail,
Right.
because, and you do it with these glorious stories, as you said. There's the scene in the film Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
By the way, I would recommend you do read Gone with the Wind. It's actually a very interesting book. It's not a profound book, it's a very rich book. which will make you very cross, but also it's quite subtle, much more subtle than the film.
Okay.
So
That's good. It could be hard to be less subtle than that.
well, the film is very unsubtle. I mean, she takes a southern point of view, and there are some things that you won't like, but it's a much more complicated novel than the film would suggest. So I don't dismiss it. To me,
Okay.
it'll make you cross, but at least it's I read it once when I was ill. It took me a long time to read, but I was quite ill, so it was quite. No, I think there are. Do you want to say anything, Melina?
Oh, well, I have a question, but you can finish.
No, it's okay. You can.
Okay, well, I'm interested in education within the war zones, and as you were bringing up the point of practical uses we could use with your research, and it made me think when you were saying that it's important that they feel part of something that's larger than just an individual. I was thinking how education could play a role in that, and also how education could possibly help them help children and families work through these emotions as the war is going on. But I was wondering if you have any suggestions from your research that you think would be really important to include in a war zone or in a zone that's recovering from war.
That's a good question. It kind of relates to your question in terms of strategies. I guess it seems to me that I think novels help a lot, help people work through some of these things afterwards. I started, doing the literature review and kind of listing some of the novels. It was interesting because there's a wonderful book by Steinbeck called The Moon is Down, which is about a fictional country, you're pretty sure it's Norway. And it's written in a very simple style. And it was actually produced under a book publisher called Édition de Minuit, Midnight Press, which was a clandestine press in Paris, published by a guy who did wedding invitations. And they would have these books, so they couldn't go to a regular publisher. This is a big question for intellectuals. How do you respond if you're occupied by people you don't like, by policies you find abhorrent? And a lot of the actors, artists went right ahead. Coco Chanel goes back and, produces her house and has an affair with somebody in the Gestapo and says, well, at my age, anybody that's likes you, you're lucky. And Maurice Chevalier, performs for the Germans, all these kinds of things. But one of these men who actually never really did very much afterwards sets up this clandestine press, and so they publish these books. The first one was The Silence of the Sea, which is a wonderful book. And so there are things that were done during the war that were books that I think touched on the wartime experience in a very personal way for the people. I think there are obviously, given the censorship that goes on during wars, there are a lot of books that have been. I mean, Jean Anouilh did a reproduction of Antigone, which was set in modern garb, and it was pretty close to the edge. I mean, he didn't want to get arrested, but it was pretty obvious that the scene where Antigone goes and defies her uncle, and buries the brother, is, what that represents, the individual spirit refusing to crumple under authority. So I think there are a lot of books that can be very helpful. Whether or not they let you publish those is another issue, but some of them are out there. I mean, obviously all the Shakespeare, there's a lot of political in Shakespeare about how you deal with this. I think there's a lot of personal biographies and autobiographies that are wonderful, that tell you how people deal with things during wars. And there's a lot of movies that come out with these things. I mean, Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, Life is Beautiful. I mean, there's all kinds of Hurt Locker. So I think those are things that help people with an emotional component that I think talking. I mean, it would be nice if everybody could have therapy all the time, but we don't have funding for that. But I think that's part of it. I think there also is some work that's being done using kind of virtual reality machines to help people who've lived through traumatic events. Cheryl Koopman is doing some work on that. I think with 9/11, so that they will put people in a machine and they hook them up to see how their blood pressure is. And Tamar probably knows about more of this than I do.
And there is a lot of work on post-traumatic syndrome.
Yeah. And they'll have they'll see it, there'll be a sound of a plane, and that'll put people, and then they'll stop, and then they'll wait, and they'll put them back in. And the idea is that it can torpedo the time period shrink the time period that you, with regular talk therapy, that you can go through this, and that by reliving the experience, it kind of desensitizes it a little bit. And so those are cheaper ways to kind of deal with these things. But then there's also, I'm blanking on his name, he's from Texas, he does a lot of expressive writing that he has people do. I mean, I think one of the interesting, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, it's called, it's about an inner school teacher in Long Beach, California, and she had these students who were in these horrible inner cities where always being shot and killed. What's it called?
You know, like Marva Collins?
It's something about writing.
Yeah, writing. Anyway, it's about they start writing about their lives and what it's like, and she freedom writers, yeah. And so then she published the book, and the movie came out, and one of the kids actually went to the premiere, and on the way home he was killed, which was ironic. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of stuff that can be helpful for kids' education in the zone.
Yeah, it makes me wonder what would happen if we could bring out their voices while the war was happening, and even if it couldn't come out in that country, but if we could get it out in other countries that weren't blocking that media, and when the news report comes up about the war this, the war that, and you could also bring up like the voices of the humanity behind
Well, I
it.
think this is the one thing, the multimedia, I think the blogs are making a big difference. There's been a lot of work on in Israeli blogs during one of the problems during the war, I forgot which time period they took, somebody did some research on it where, there's a lot of isolation. I mean, during the Boston, you were closed down, but there's media. If you have a blog, you can write things, you can have people responding. And one of my students did a very interesting paper on how the blogosphere kind of created a culture for democracy in Egypt that really then was very important. And this is a building on Benedict Anderson's work on how nationalism developed only when you had newspapers. Newspapers had to be in one language. Right. People who read one language had a community, as an imaginary community. So I think the whole idea of blogs and social media are something we're just beginning to get into, but I think that can be very important both in creating a narrative for war and creating one for peace. So it's very interesting how it can be used.
I want to say thank you so much, Kristen, for this amazing contribution.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Michelle, also, for your very helpful contribution. Thank you, all of you, for coming. And I hope also thank you people who will watch this later on in the privacy of their computers when they can watch the link. So I hope that also you will continue to come to, this is the last session of this series this year, but we will be having them next year. And I don't know if you're on the mailing list, you must have got the information, the CMEI list.
Oh, I don't think I am.
You didn't? Okay, can you just give me your email address? Obviously you are on it, aren't you?
Well, it came over the internet, but I actually just picked it up today.
Right, should have been coming, okay.
Yeah, usually it knows
it has been sent out earlier on, so.
Yeah.
If you'd like to give me your email address. And Tamara, I think you're just here this year, aren't you, Sue?
I'm just.
Yes.
She's barely here this year. She's going and going so
Okay.
much during the next couple of weeks. It's amazing. And you're going off shortly, aren't you going?
Not till the end of May. I've been, this weekend I go to AARA, but only for a weekend, so.
So,
thank you so
I
much.
miss seeing you on.
Turn off the.
I turned off that. So I miss seeing you on Monday, though I have
I'm
you
so
on tape.
sorry.
No, that's quite all right.
Well, I will go through, thank you so much, John. I will go through, there are some bits of it which have not been correctly transcribed, but I'll just check that, and you've got, I've got the figures were correct about 1 in 100.
Yeah, it is hard.